We see that here just right in the first chapter. As early as the first chapter, we see that's challenging. But being that it is challenging, today we're just going to lay some groundwork for the book, just kind of introduce it a little bit before we begin our in-depth study. But I think with this particular book, our laying of the groundwork should begin by knowing something about the author of this book. Now, as far as authorship is concerned, it is not certain whether this book was written by Hosea himself or if it was written by someone who knew Hosea and was one of his followers. Hosea does not name himself as the author, so we don't know for sure if he wrote it or if somebody else did. Another possibility, however, as far as authorship is concerned, another possible author is that it might have been someone who had access to the written record of Hosea's preaching, such as a scribe or a group of scribes who compiled everything we read in Hosea into the book we have today. Going on, the next piece of groundwork that should be laid for a book like Hosea is the date and when it was written. Now, like the author, we can't know for certain when Hosea was written, but even though that's the case, from the text of Hosea itself, we can know that it was written sometime after the biblical historical events that are referenced in this book. For example, as we'll see in a few moments, from the opening verse of this book, we can assume that it was written sometime after the rule of some of the kings of Judah and Israel. We're going to see that here in verse 1 in just a few moments. Now, if that's the case, this book was written sometime between 760 and 720 BC. Going on, the next piece of groundwork that should be laid as we enter into this study is the audience as to who it was written to. Now, as far as audience is concerned, we can assume that Hosea's audience is God's people, especially their kings. Now, one reason we can assume that is because much of Hosea's preaching that we read in this book is addressed to God's people and their kings who are living unfaithfully toward God. Going on, another piece of groundwork we should lay before we enter into a study is the why. When we're entering into a study of any book of the Bible, one question we have to ask is, why was this book written? Now, as with Hosea, as to why Hosea was written, we don't have any clear purpose as to why it was written because we don't find what's called a purpose statement. We don't find a verse in this book that says, here's why it was written. But so, as we look at the text of Hosea, however, one probable purpose as to why this book was written is to address the unfaithfulness of God's people and their kings, and in an effort to bring them back into this right relationship with God. Now, with that being true, we could also say that the purpose of Hosea is to rebuke God's people and to urge them toward repentance. Questions or comments on any of those things? Author, date, purpose? Okay. So this is what brings us into the text of Hosea itself. We're going to spend some time with verses 1 and 2 today, look at some more groundwork for this book, and that'll help us to better prepare our minds for our study of this book. From the first part of verse 1, we'll look closer at the man Hosea himself, and we'll see that there's not much known about him for certain. From the second part of verse 1, we'll see that the book of Hosea is set in a historical context. We'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, from verse 2, we'll see that among other things, the book of Hosea is a story of a man who was commanded to marry and have children with a harlot. We'll talk a little bit about that. But what the application of all that to us will be that Hosea is a book that deserves our study. And again, we'll touch on that. But so today, getting into the text, we're just going to look at verses 1 and 2. If somebody wouldn't mind reading those two verses for us, and then we'll talk about them.
The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah,
Thank you, Dean. Okay, so again, we're still laying some groundwork for the book, but we're beginning here with Hosea himself. But verse 1 starts off with this word of the Lord. Now, what is the word of the Lord when we see that phrase? Okay, that's true, but when we see it with this phraseology, the word of the Lord which came, what's the scenario here? It's like a prophecy. So that's the part of the phraseology. So it's this idea of God communicating when we see that phrase in this particular kind of context. So what's happening here? What's God doing? Okay, Hosea's getting a message from God. Yes, God's speaking to Hosea. So that's how this book starts off. It's just God's communicating with Hosea. And something else we should know about this statement is that it is also, this phrase also gives us some context for the book of Hosea. Now, one reason that's true is because the book of Hosea, as a whole, it's made up of messages from God that are communicated through Hosea. Now, with this, so what these things tell us about the man Hosea, among other things, is that he was someone with whom God communicated. So that's the implication behind this first phrase. But what else does this verse tell us about Hosea himself? Son of Berai, I don't know how it's pronounced, so I think we would all have different pronunciations. So this is another piece of Hosea's background. He was the name of his father, Berai. Again, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced. But beyond these facts, there is nothing really that we know about Hosea. Now, as far as Berai is concerned, this is the only mention we have of him in his connection with Hosea. But his name, however, the name Berai, does appear one other time in the Old Testament, and that is in the text of Genesis 26, verse 34. In that verse, the name shows up as this person being the father of Esau's wife, Judith. So there's only one other mention of Berai, but as far as Hosea is concerned, this is the only connection we have to Hosea, is that there was another person named Berai who was the father of Hosea. Over in Genesis 26, there's a second individual being the father of Esau's wife, Judith. So the point of all that is that we don't know a lot about Hosea outside of this book. We know he's someone with whom God communicated. We know he had a father named Berai, and everything else we know about Hosea just comes through the text of the book itself. So, as a result, there are several things we don't know about Hosea, but we're still going to explore that a little bit. From the overall context of the book, we can gain some idea about the man Hosea. Context of the book indicates that Hosea was familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. When we get into our study, we'll see some of that. The context of the book also indicates he was a smart man, or an intelligent man, we might say. Also, from the context of the book, God may have communicated with him even before the events of this book. But this is not something we can know for certain. Now, in addition to all of that, we might also be able to suggest that Hosea was a young man when he became one of God's messengers. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. But anything else on the man Hosea on this background information? Go ahead, Helene. Yes.
Was actually mentioned in Genesis?
The name.
Just the name.
Just the name.
I think it is the same man.
Probably not the same person. No, just another individual named Berai. So, good question. Anything else on the man Hosea before we get into this next part of verse 1? All right. So the next point we're going to look at is simply that the book of Hosea is set in a historical context. When we're studying the Bible, we do need to keep that in mind, cultural, historical context. We see a little bit of that here. So in the second part of verse 1, we're moving from Hosea's background to the historical time frame in which he preached. Now, according to that second part of verse 1, when was Hosea doing his preaching, and what time period?
During the kings of Judah that are Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah.
Okay, and who else is mentioned here in the second part of verse 1? Jeroboam. Who's he the king of? The king of Israel. Okay, so this is the information that we have. So as we see in the text, in this part of the verse, the author is recording the names of several kings, 4 of which ruled over Judah, and the 5th of which ruled over Israel. Now the kings named here are kings that we read about both in the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. That's where we find their names. But also something else we know based on passages like Amos 1 verse 1 and Micah 1 verse 1. Hosea's ministry overlapped with that of the prophets we read about in those books. A lot of these minor prophets that we find in the latter part of the Old Testament, their ministries overlapped with each other. So they might have known each other. Now with that in mind, Hosea's ministry would have lasted approximately 50 years, based on how long each of these kings remained in power during Hosea's ministry. More specifically, his ministry would have lasted from 760 to 710 BC, is what's been said. So putting all these things together, then the point we should see from these things about the book of Hosea is that it is set in a historical context. There's a time frame we can reference. So in this second part of verse 1, the author has shown that the things we read about in the book of Hosea, they took place in this part of the history of God's people when these kings were in power. More specifically, certain passages in the book of Hosea show that the things we read about in this book took place during a time when even though certain kings were in power, those kings were also not respected. For example, in Hosea 10, verse 3, we read about the fact that during the ministry of Hosea, God's people as a whole had no respect either for God or for their kings. That's how unfaithful they were becoming. So it's for this reason that it's been said that the events of Hosea are set in a time of, and I quote, volatile political situation where power changed hands rapidly because kings lived their lives in rebellion toward God. It was a very tumultuous time in the history of God's people, is part of what that means. So questions or comments on this part of verse 1? Okay. So now we're going to verse 2, another piece of groundwork that we're going to lay for Hosea. And we're going to see from this verse that among other things, Hosea is the story of a man who was commanded to marry and have children with a harlot. And that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time. So we know from verse 1, the word of the Lord comes to Hosea. We got the time frame in which that happens. But now here in verse 2, we find what God says to Hosea. What does God say to him? And here in this first part of verse 2. What kind of wife? A wife of harlotry. What is harlotry? It's prostitution. When you see that word harlot or harlotry, it has to do with prostitution. It's also been used in a context of an unfaithful person, but this is most likely a prostitute. So, God says to Hosea, I want you to go marry this kind of woman. But he doesn't stop there. What else is he to do with this woman? Have children with her. The text uses that phrase, children of harlotry. So, this is what God tells Hosea to do. Go marry a prostitute. Have children with her. And again, we know that because of this word harlotry. It refers to prostitution, but it could also refer to some other kind of sexually immoral behavior. Whatever the case, this isn't the kind of woman your average guy would want to marry. But God tells them, go marry this woman. Now, something else we should know here is that the command Hosea receives here is the first of two. he receives to marry a woman of this nature. And that's something we know because in Hosea 3:1, Hosea is commanded to love a woman who is loved by her husband but is still an adulteress. Now, with that in mind, we also see the reason God commands Hosea to do this. Why? How does yours read?
It says
Whoredom?
whoredom.
Okay, I haven't seen that translation. Yeah, because the New American Standard has, for the land commits flagrant harlotry. So, putting all those pieces in mind, the reason God commands Hosea to do these things is because God's people are being unfaithful toward God. In the same way that an adulteress is a wife who's being unfaithful toward her husband. So, since that's true, what God commands Hosea to do here, it's a pivotal moment. It's a very significant moment in the book because what God commands Hosea to do lays the foundation for everything else that we read in the book. More specifically, it lays the foundation for what Hosea's ministry is about. His ministry is about the fact that God's people are living in unfaithfulness toward him, and that's what we see in this last statement. The reason God is commanding Hosea to marry this kind of woman and have children with her is because of what God's people are doing. Now again, the New American Standard says the land commits flagrant harlotry, forsaking the Lord. Does anyone else have a different reading there on that last part of verse 2? No? Say that again, Matt? You have guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, apparently there's all kinds of different translations to that.
Mine says be departing from the Lord.
Okay, so you have be departing from the Lord now. Do you have anything about harlotry right before that?
For the land has committed great harlotry.
Okay, the land has committed great harlotry. Okay, so we have that, and you have whoredom.
Yeah.
That's weird.
Well, this is a
It's not bad, it's
no,
just
this is a
strange.
Bible school study Bible.
Okay,
And I think that you got to think about the context of who they're translating this for.
right.
And so they're using they call it the English Standard Version.
So it's the English Standard Version. Okay, I didn't look at the English Standard Version.
It may be a more kind of modern,
Right,
way of thinking about that because of how this is being used.
right, to help with people. So that's okay. I just hadn't heard the word whoredom. Okay. So even though it's the case, the Hebrew term here is still the harlotry term that has to do with prostitution.
Regardless, it's
Yeah,
like, oh, how horrific this is. I mean, because you already said, it's like Hosea was a young man, and as a young man, he's got a lot of life ahead of him.
right.
And yet he's being told to go and marry this kind of person. And, I mean, it's just very graphic.
It is very graphic. So this has something to do in connection with what God's people are doing. The text said, New American Standard, flagrant harlotry, extreme whoredom. What are they doing, God's people? There's idol worship involved, absolutely.
They're living extremely sinful lives.
Exactly. They're moving further and further away from God. But the text uses the word land. The word land here, it's not the literal land. It's just a way of referring to God's people who are living in that land. They're in the promised land. They're where God brought them to, but they're not being faithful to God. So God says to Hosea, go marry this kind of woman. But why? The text tells us why, but what else could we suggest? What's Hosea's role in all of this?
He's a mirror. I mean, he's going to be a mirror to them of their egregious behavior.
Exactly. A mirror is a good word to illustrate this, to reflect what God is experiencing. So the experiences of Hosea in an unfaithful marriage that he's entering into would reflect the experiences God was having with his people because of their unfaithfulness. In other words, as one commentator put it, Hosea was about to experience the sorrows of God and speak in God's place to the nation. So Hosea was going to experience in his own marriage to this harlot the sadness of God in his relationship with his people because of their unfaithfulness. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay. So, the point we should see from verse 2 as far as the introduction to Hosea is concerned is that Hosea is the story of a man who was commanded to marry and have children with a harlot. Hosea is about to enter into a marriage and have children with a woman who was going to be unfaithful to him. Now we have to put ourselves a little bit in that mindset, just entering into a marriage where you 100% know your spouse is going to be unfaithful to you. That's where Hosea is. But the purpose of this is, Elaine put it, it's the mirror. To mirror what God's people are doing to God, being extremely unfaithful to him. So, being that's the case, being that Hosea was would be entering into that kind of marriage, that's what would qualify him to speak on God's behalf, because he'd be experiencing that unfaithfulness for himself. So Hosea tells the story of Hosea's experiences in his ministry that hinged upon this command to marry a woman who would be unfaithful to him in order to better equip him for his ministry of preaching to God's unfaithful people. So when we consider just these pieces that we've studied today, the point we should be left with about the book of Hosea is that the book of Hosea is a book which warns us against unfaithfulness against God. We've seen that little is known about the man Hosea beyond what we read in this book. It's a book that's set in a historical context, and finally, it's the story of a man who was commanded to marry a harlot. This is not a happy book. I'm going to warn you of that right now. But there's stuff we need to be aware of in this book that we can make application to ourselves. But as far as this introductory things are concerned, that Hosea is a book that deserves our study. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Well, he is a godly man. You make a good point. A lot of the prophets suffered. But Hosea is in a position unto himself in the way that he suffered because of this marriage that he's told to enter into. And we're going to see more of that starting next week, especially when we start looking at his children. Go ahead, Elaine. Yeah. Exactly. So that's why he's kind of in a category unto himself because of the marriage that he's in. And yeah, he probably would have been lacking credibility, but this is all coming from God. He still had God behind him. So, anything else? Okay. So again, this is a book that deserves our study. It urges us to be faithful to God. It shows us what unfaithfulness toward God looks like. And since that's true, Hosea also deserves our study because it's a book that calls attention to what God expects of us as his people. Now, those are just, again, some applications. Anything else, last call?
I'm just thankful it's a short, minor prophet.
It is a minor prophet. It has several chapters, but a lot of these chapters, they're short enough they can be covered in one study. And that's going to be true of chapter 1, because we'll be through chapter 1 next week. Anything else? All right. Matt, will you close us in prayer today?